All right, welcome to Cannabinoids Day 1, Part 3. This is the final part of the first day of the cannabinoid lectures. All right, today we'll talk more about the neurochemistry and biochemistry of cannabinoids. All right, what are they? Well, they're like everything, molecules. They're broken down into molecules. They're not terribly super large molecules, as you can kind of see here. But where are those molecules? Well, they're called cannabinoids because they're found in the cannabis plant. And the cannabis plant, this seven-leaved plant or weed, has many cannabinoids, many more than the two that you pretty much hear about all the time, like THC and CBD. There's 70 at least in this particular plant, in different parts of the plant as well, not just the leaves. But the ones that we'll be talking mostly about are cannabidiol or CBD, which you've, I'm sure, seen because there are millions of companies out there selling it all the time, CBD oil and such, and THC. And that's the more psychoactive component of the plant. And if you smoke it, you're getting some sort of mixture of the two. And the ratio of the two can determine the psychoactive components or the result of the drug. All right, in each of those components, the CBD and THC has very different effects on the brain and on the body. CBD is much more sedative. That's the thing that we think might reduce convulsions and epilepsy. It might be more effective at in managing inflammation and anxiety and nausea. The cancer fighting thing, I think, is a little bit too preliminary. That's based on some very limited studies. So I would put that more on the sideline for now. All right, I hope it does, but so far there's very limited evidence for that. All right, as far as THC, that's again the more psychoactive component. It also might be the component involved in some pain reduction, but it can also produce aggression alone, and also can actually increase nausea, whereas CBD seems to decrease it, and can stimulate appetite. But again, the more psychoactive, the thing that gives you the high mostly is the THC. All right, so those are the parts in the plant, THC and CBD. But then you have your brain's own cannabinoids that really don't look that much at all chemically like the ones in the plant. So in some chemicals, like psilocin, psilocybin from the mushroom, it looks a lot kind of like serotonin and things like that. Well, not the case here for cannabinoids. The chemical structures look quite different, at least when you look at their structure diagram, the endogenous ones that your brain produces versus the ones you get from the plant. But in the end, something about their three-dimensional shape makes them bind really well with the endogenous cannabinoid receptors. So it comes down to the three-dimensional shape and what little components of those molecules bind most nicely with the receptors, the three-dimensional shape of the receptors. All right, cannabinoids, exogenous and endogenous. The exogenous ones are, again, the ones that you would get from the plant. Endogenous, what are the ones that the brain itself uses, produces? All right. Yeah, so the plant, of course, is the name of the drug, or even the endogenous one, cannabinoids, the cannabis plant. And most of these cannabinoids can be found in the resin that kind of oozes out of the top of the plant. So if you want the highest concentration, that's where you get it, from the resin. If you remember the opioid poppy, that's where you also get the highest concentrations of opioids. But it's the same thing with cannabinoids. It's that resin that oozes out of the top. So hashish is a derivative of the plant that is actually directly from the resin, and that derivative can be either smoked or eaten itself. So it's another form of taking cannabis. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, there are at least 70 unique cannabinoids in the plant. We'll probably discover some more. And the major psychoactive compound is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. So that's the thing that, again, gives people more of the high. The exogenous cannabinoids are agonists. Basically, they activate different cannabinoid receptors in the brain. And there are only two major receptors that people have studied the most in the brain. It's called CB1 for cannabinoid 1 and CB2, cannabinoid 2. We'll talk about those in a moment. All right, so how does marijuana, or just cannabinoids in general, work in the brain. So A, where are the receptors for cannabinoids? And I just mentioned there's the CB1 receptor and the CB2 receptor. And how do they change or alter neural activity? I really won't get to the alter neural activity in this segment, but we'll get to that. All right, endogenous cannabinoids. All right, the ones in the brain. We know of 7 so far. Actually, the number probably has gone up since last I made this slide, but there are 2 that are by far the most well studied. One is called anandamide, and the other one is called 2-AG. I'm not going to go through the whole chemical name of that, not worth it, but just remember anandamide and 2-AG are the two of the brain's own neurotransmitters that are cannabinoids. And they're interesting neurotransmitters because they're definitely not like your classic transmitters like dopamine or glutamate or GABA. They instead are lipid soluble, so they pay no attention to those lipid membranes that block out essentially everything outside of the cell, unless you can get into a receptor or transporter or something like that. These cannabinoids can actually pass through the lipids. They just can dissolve right through them. And so they're capable of what we call, and I've talked about before, retrograde neurotransmission, and they're called retrograde neurotransmitters because they can pass from the postsynaptic side of the synapse backwards into the presynaptic side of the synapse. And so they might perform unique functions in controlling neural excitability and neuroplasticity. All right. As I mentioned before, there are 2 major receptors that have been studied for cannabinoids, the CB1 receptor and the CB2. Now, both are found both in the body and in the brain, or in the peripheral and central nervous system. But there's a higher density of the CB1 receptor in the brain and the central nervous system. There's some in the peripheral nervous system. The CB2, there's more in the body and the peripheral nervous system, but there's also some in the central nervous system. So you get both in both places, but the proportions are different. All right, and our knowledge of these receptors isn't that old. We only first identified it as actually being a receptor back in 1988, and anandamide back in 1992. All right, so yeah, I remember that. So you see, I graduated from high school in 88. Entered the Peace Corps in 1992, so yeah, easy to remember. All right, we're still at the very beginning of understanding what these cannabinoids and what these receptors do in the brain, but we do definitely know that they're doing a lot because they're everywhere in the brain. They're everywhere. Okay, so where are these CB1 cannabinoid receptors in the brain? The short answer is everywhere. It's amazing how ubiquitous these little guys are. So you'll find more CB1 receptors than any other G protein coupled receptor, any other metabotropic receptor in the brain. So the image on the right shows the relative density of these CB1 receptors in different brain regions of a rat, where the hotter color indicates the concentration of these CB1 receptors, and you see that they're everywhere from the bottom, which is the cerebellum, to the front, which is the frontal cortex. So more specifically, you can find these CB1 receptors very densely in the hippocampus, which we've learned is important for memory formation and consolidation, navigation as well. You find many of them in the frontal cortex, which is critical for decision making and other forms of executive function like planning and attention. They're all over the striatum and the cerebellum, which is important for movement, motor control, motor learning, learning of habits and addiction, and all over the hypothalamus, which is involved in so many things, but one of those is feeding, and so it might explain why people get the munchies when they smoke pot. The amygdala, which is critical for anxiety. So you see these CB1 receptors all over the place, and these are the ones that are more highly concentrated in the central nervous system. The CB2 receptors, on the other hand, are more densely concentrated in the peripheral nervous system and also just in the body itself. So you see them in the bone, in our immune system in the body, in our fat cells, and in the GI tract. But they are also in the brain, not nearly as highly concentrated as the CB1 receptor, but they're there. And like the body, they also seem to be involved in the immune response in the brain. So you'll see them in microglia. And if you remember, microglia are those neat little glial cells that are involved in the brain's own immune response. And so they might be involved when those microglia are activated and ready to, let's say, attack an invading critter or something that's invaded the brain. Okay. Now the next slide. Okay, this slide is just to maybe remind you of where some of these brain regions are, in this case, that have the CB1 receptor. And as you can see, all the ones that are circled have the CB1 receptor. And it's just to remind you that it's just amazing how prevalent these receptors are in the brain. They're everywhere. So that's just, I won't try to trick you on an exam, like saying which area does not have a CB1 receptor, because usually the answer is every area has the CB1 receptor. So that's the only thing you really need to remember. They're all over the place. Okay, with that, I will move on to the final slide, end of day 1 on cannabinoids. All right, that's it.